All right. Okay. So for today's class, we are looking at comparative literature, the definition of comparative literature. We're looking at the French School of Comparative Literature and the American School of Comparative Literature. So we're focusing primarily on comparative literature within the 20th century discourse, right? And then next week we will take it to the current century. So, as always, when we're looking at anything new, it's good to set the scene of our discussion. What's the context of our discussion? One of the key contexts of our discussion is when we look at a literary work, how do we conduct the critical discussion and interpretation of a literary work? So have a look at this quotation. And I want you to think about this question. How will this idea that is being presented in this quotation help or deter your interpretation, the way you interpret a text as a reader, the way you read a text? Okay, so the quote is, and I quote, "Interpretation of works of literature is the process of thinking about their details in order to see how the details interconnect and what ideas they convey." That's the first part of the quote. The second part, interpretation requires us to read actively rather than passively. When we read purely for fun, we are passive, letting the work wash over us, not trying to figure it out. But when we interpret, we pay close attention to the potential meaning of details. So there are key components of this very critical quote on interpretation. So what I want to hear from you in terms of thoughts is, how will this affect you as a reader? When I give you a text to read, how do you engage with the work of fiction? What's your role? How do you participate in that communication with the text? Can I hear some thoughts? Can I hear your thoughts? Okay.
I'll start. Usually, for me, it's whether or not the details are were they written figuratively, or are they supposed to mean something else? That's how I engage with the work of fiction, because it's fictional, and I don't take whatever that the writer was trying to say at face value. Yeah, so that's how I engage, but I'm not sure how the details, how I connect them until I get to the end of the novel, and then I think about it for a few more days and then reach my own conclusion.
Okay. Good, Ruby. Anybody else?
As for me, when I read a text, at first I might not understand the text because there are deeper meanings in literary text. So I'll go back for the second time and then pinpoint elements that may produce deeper level of meaning of the text, and then I'll search up through the internet and then see what matches according to the timeline, or maybe the reason why the author writes in that manner. And then after consider all possible factors in between those elements, and then I reach my conclusion what the story is actually about. That's
Okay. Okay, so that's the methodology that you take. Okay, good. Somebody else?
Sorry.
Yes, Salim.
Okay, I usually read the environment of writing that text first, and then understanding the writer's life and what made him to write that. Was it that under the influence of certain circumstances? Was the circumstance that pushed him to write such a text?
All right, good. Somebody else?
I think it's okay. Ren, go first.
Who wants to go first? Okay. Let's go ahead.
Okay, when I'm reading I think the setting comes first. So I need to understand the background of the story, and then is the experience of the author. And first, I'm interested in the story first, and later maybe there is something deeper about their society, and some problems caused by some problem exists in the society. That's all.
All right. Shah?
Yeah, for me, I think probably almost the same like everybody. We tend to reason things, right? We tend to think like, how can this one deal with this one, and how it interconnects, and how it evolves around each other, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
So for me, it's more of like when you read, you try to interconnect it to the things that we learn in class, like the theories, and also what are the universal themes, and if we can like recall any of these ideas connected to other works. So yeah, I think that's also will help in the interpretation of the works of literature.
Okay, good. Lisa,
May
did
I-
you? Yeah,
Sorry.
Ruby, go ahead. Go
No,
ahead.
because I was just reminded because I read something the other day while trying to prepare for this course. That does it okay, the relevancy of the writer's intention, should it matter in how we interpret the text? Because for some people, the text is the text itself, despite whatever the writer was thinking about. But I like to Wikipedia the writer's background, and supposedly, like, okay, this is what they're trying to say. I want to match that writer. But yeah, so the relevancy of the writer's background in us interpreting the text is what I'm interested to know more.
Okay. Aimee, do you mind repeating what you said? I forgot to write it down.
When I actually read the text several times in order to get everything cleared out or to understand every single thing about the text. Basically, I would take out elements that I think is significant in the text, and then I would Google it out, maybe relating it to the current issue, the past issue, the news, the facts that happen at that setting, and then try to relate it to the text so I could get like a holistic view of what the text is about.
Okay, cool. Lisa, did you want to pitch in? I see you keep coming in and out. I think the line is pretty bad, huh? Lisa, did you want to?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the line is pretty bad here. Sorry about that. So I had to turn off my video camera.
No problem.
Yeah, about the question, like for me, like interpretation in literature is vastly different from how we usually read, like a storybook or something like that. Storybook is something like we do for leisure, and I don't think much about it while reading it. Like I'm in the moment, have fun, but I don't think about it like 1 or 2 weeks after I finish reading the book. Whereas for literature, how do you say it? Sometimes it could be quite dull, but how do you say it? When I learn to read between the lines, and it makes me think a lot. So I sometimes ponder about it for weeks, maybe even months to come. Like several literature books are. I find like that. It may seem dull at first, but it keeps you thinking, and because I think it affects us so much because it's so, how to say, it's close to us as a reader. Yeah, that's how I feel. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Let's move on. I want you to keep those thoughts that you've got in mind, yeah, because it's going to, it's significant, it's of value to our discussion. So the bit that I want you all wanted you all to focus on in this particular quote was the role of the reader. How active or passive are you in the act of interpretation, meaning making? So when you talk about interpretation, there is the story on the one hand, and there is the reader making sense of the story on the other. So I see that, you know, in terms of understanding the role of the reader, all of you realize how significant your role is in meaning making, in the way the text is brought to life. It's not so much the role of the writer to tell you the story, it's also the role of the reader to make sense of what the writer is trying to tell us. The story, the language, the symbolisms, you know, you all keep saying, a few of you kept saying things like reading between the lines. So the act of interpretation definitely requires you as the reader to play an active role. So the role of the reader is significant in the act of interpretation. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the what, why, and how of comparative literature. So another important quote, a bit dated but still significant, by Matthew Arnold in 1857, his Oxford inaugural lecture. One of the statements that he made in that lecture was, "Everywhere there is connection, everywhere there is illustration. No single event, no single literature is adequately comprehended except in relation to other events and to other literatures." I think this is the point that we want to kind of like bring back to, especially in the context of comparative literature. What kind of connections are we seeing between texts, right? What kind of intertextuality, interconnection do we see between texts? And this is something also that we need to do more consciously within this course called comparative literature. So historically, when we think about comparative literature, the emergence of it, you know, you can even trace it back to 1798, when the term of universal poesy was introduced. And again, in the 18th century, universal literature in Germany, or Goethe's 1827 term, world literature. However, we have to keep in mind that despite the use of the word universal and world, the term was very much Eurocentric. You know, it was still very much within the Greek, the French, the English worldviews, maybe even the German worldview. So the literatures, the writings coming out from Europe was still considered, quote unquote, universal and world, right? So it's an important term, right? It's an important term to refer to a kind of a field that is developing in which there are commonalities of human experiences and heritage being celebrated. However, it has to be kept in mind, people from outside of Europe, writers and scholars from outside of Europe, was not included in this quote unquote world literature or universal literature term, right? And so when you think about comparative literature in the English world context, right? So comparative literature in the 19th century, then we take it slightly further, in the 19th century, we're looking at English classics and they are being compared to Greek classics, right? So if you're studying writings by William Shakespeare or Milton's Paradise Lost, you're comparing them to Greek tragic poets. So that's the idea of comparative literature within the English world in the 19th century. And this idea is also reinforced by Matthew Arnold in 1848 when he talks about using masterpieces as a touchstone. You know, you make a comparison between the writings of Shakespeare and the masterworks of the Greek poets, and how much and to what extent Shakespeare's works and Milton's works and all of these English writers from the English literary canon, to what extent have their works reached the level of the masters, right? But again, like I said, the problem with this definition, the worldview is very much Eurocentric, right? It excludes literary traditions from the rest of the non-English speaking world, right? So if you look at the age of transition, focus primarily on the first two looks at the context and the second two looks at the text. So this is coming from Susan Bassnett's 1993 book, Comparative Literature. So we're looking at the 20th century, towards the end of the 20th century. So this book, Comparative Literature by Bassnett, was seminal, you know, and in that it captures the key parameters of comparative literature and how comparative literature was viewed, especially within the Western Anglo-American schools in the 20th century, okay? So one of the things that Bassnett talks about early on in the book is the kind of the changes or the transformation that was happening within the context of nation and nation states. So early 19th century nations were you know, championing for independence against the colonial masters, right? Against the imperialists. And these nations, upon receiving independence, began to also explore, you know, rightly so, concepts like national identities and national cultures. And with that, national literature, right? So that's the context of what was happening in the 19th century. We're looking at early 19th century right up to mid 19th century, including countries like India in the 1945 or 47, I forget, and Malaysia, you know, 1957, and other countries and other parts of the world, including countries in the continent of Africa, where, you know, nation were receiving independence from the colonial masters, and with that, a kind of a transformation was happening in the landscape of the country, right? So what then happens is, within the literary world, what's the repercussion of that? If you think about the English literary tradition, they tend to be very much in the top tier, in terms of hierarchy, in the hierarchy of literature. English literary tradition tends to lead the way. European works tend to lead the way in terms of the hierarchy, right? And because of that also, post-independence, a lot of the writings that are being produced in English by these independent nations are still being compared to the colonial tongue and the colonial literature produced by the English writers. So that's the age of transition that we're looking at. And because of this, literature's being produced outside the Eurocentric centers, especially the English centers, the imperialist centers, they are considered to an extent worthless, quote unquote, worthless, primitive, banal, right? Whereas writers such as Shakespeare was, quote unquote, seen on a higher plane than most anyone else. So it's always how close to these writers are the writings from outside the center, from Africa, from the continent of Africa, from India, from Southeast Asia, from Asia generally. How well do these writers write? Can they compete? Can they meet the expectations or standards set by, you know, writers from the center? And largely because of that as well, these writings from India, Africa, and the Caribbeans, they were judged as incompatible for comparative study with literature from England and Europe, right? So back to the statement made earlier, if you think about this, so, you know, in the 18th century, when they were talking about universal literature and world literature, the issue is not so much the term being used, but the operative definition of these terms. Like, what do they mean by world and universal? Okay, so that's something as scholars or students of comparative literature, you need to always challenge every article that you read about comparative literature. You need to challenge the writer's operational definition. When you use words like world literature and universal literature, do you include writings from outside of Europe and England and America, right? Do you include writings from India and Africa and the Caribbeans and parts of and Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific and all that? So this is something we need to kind of work around, you know, especially when we think about comparative literature within the 20th century. So then, you know, as I said, you know, going from you know, the early 19th century, nations were struggling for independence, and then post that, when nations have become independent, you have post-colonial nations or post-independent nations. With that kind of context of post-colonialism, the countries who are now independent are now forging their own literary tradition. And these literary traditions are beginning to take root in their countries, right? And within the discipline of comparative literature, one thing that we need to take into consideration is that how are these texts read alongside what we talked about last week, world literature, the great works, you know? How far can we bring in writings by writers who have not won awards, who have not been recognized in international bestseller list or what have you, right? So that is a problem that was being discussed and problematized by the scholars of comparative literature at the tail end of the 20th century. So, you know, to kind of sum the whole discussion up, so this is how Basnet defines comparative literature in her book, in the 1993 book on comparative literature. The study of text across cultures, that it is interdisciplinary and that it is concerned with patterns of connection in literature across both time and space. So I want you to look at the marked difference and the dropping of nation state, languages, national borders, you know, all that, and just focusing on the study of text across cultures, right? It is interdisciplinary. It is concerned with patterns of connection in literature across both time and space. I want you to keep in mind, when we talk about text being read across cultures, do they assume that there are many cultures in one nation, or there is only one culture in each nation? Which one do you think?
I think it's many cultures in one nation.
Okay, Alice, you think many cultures in one nation? Anybody else?
Yes, many cultures in one nation.
Okay, anyone else? Think about the second half of the definition. Look at the second half of the definition of comparative literature. Patterns of connection in literatures across both time and space. Space there means geographical space.
For me, when I read this, I think it refers to only one culture in
Right. Who's saying that? Is that Aimee?
Yes, it's me.
Okay, all right. Because I can't see your faces, so yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, but I wonder, Doctor, because sometimes cultures can also be different based on the time. It can be set, you know, amongst the same people, but the culture they're practicing are different. So how do we then, can we compare intergenerational or generational difference?
Right.
Is it also part of culture?
That's a good point. Write that down, keep that in mind. We'll come back to it when we look at comparative literature in the 21st century. But I want you all to problematize this definition to begin with, because it's important for you to find a definition of comparative literature or to coin a definition of comparative literature as your operational definition based on certain scholars that you find useful or relevant to you. All right. It's important for this course, because your assignment, you will need to have a definition of comparative literature that you find relevant, that you will use as your operational definition. Okay, so if you look at Basnett's 1993 definition, the study of text across cultures, what it indicates is that each nation is monocultural, and that each nation will have its own culture. And so when we are studying text across cultures, we are inadvertently studying across national borders, right? So if you look at England, it would be assumed that England will have one culture, Germany will have one culture, France will have one culture, and so on and so forth. But as you know now, especially with migration, with movement of people from transnational movement of people from different parts of the world to Europe and vice versa, it's no longer the case, right? Each nation is not monocultural. There isn't many nations in the world that can say they are completely monocultural, right? It tends to be more multicultural, especially in England today, right? So this is the problem with that word across cultures. So every definition that you come across, you need to ask yourself, does this definition appear inclusive or exclusive? Does it include nations from from outside the centers? Centers in this case meaning Europe and England and America, the Anglo-American centers. Okay, so that's the problem with this definition. However, it does appear more inclusive. It doesn't have words like marginal or the other. If you remember from last week's definition, Stephen Tutosi's 1998 definition, right? So the idea of marginality was brought in there, but Basnett kind of stops at across cultures. However, the problem with that definition, like I said, it assumes every nation has one culture, or each text is located within a country with one culture. But that's not the case in Malaysia, for instance. Maybe in the Middle East it is, right? Maybe in China to an extent it is. But in countries like Malaysia, where we are multicultural, each text, if it is located as one text in one country, which text can we choose? Is it the text written by a writer on the Indian community, or the text written on the Malay community, or the text written on the Chinese community, or the Bajau community, or the Iban community, or there are many communities in this country, each one with its own culture. So I want you to kind of keep that as something we come back to. And something else that we're going to come back to here as well, the word world literature. Again, when the definition, when the NFL, World Football Association, or the World Cup or whatever, does it really include the world? Right? Is it really inclusive or is it exclusive? You need to problematize. So the word world needs to be deconstructed within the context of the definition. So here's another one. I'm throwing a lot of definitions to you. We'll round it up in a minute. Once we begin to read, we move across frontiers, making associations and connection. No longer reading within a single literature, but within the great open space of literature with a capital L, what Goethe termed world literature. Yeah, world literature. But again, come back to this. Literature with the capital L, but which texts are included in this canon called literature with a capital L? That's something you need to question with every definition, especially when scholars are from the Western context. Their definition tends to ignore writings and writers from outside of the centers. Now think about this idea by Albert Wendt, a New Zealander writer stroke teacher of literature. Check out his point of view. I don't believe in, I'm looking at the quote within the box, the red box, yeah? I don't believe in teaching the so-called great books because such books change from generation to generation. I just teach the literature that I like, and I hope that the students get to like it. And I hope it teaches them ways of looking at other books. And then they go on ahead and read whatever they want. And if they think a certain book is great, they can call it great. But teaching a course called Great Books, I don't go for that. Because if you look at a list of those great books, they are usually very ethnocentric. That's why I don't prescribe a list of great books. Okay, so I like this idea because I'm very much from this school of thought. You know, there isn't a school of thought called Wendt's School of Thought, unfortunately, because I would definitely be a member there. But the idea of we teachers of literature, we teach what we think, what we like, as to quote Albert Wendt here, this is, so the list that you have for this course, for instance, these are books that I like, not because I like in a sense that I feel that there is value in it, right? And I hope you will come to see the value in it as well. But for your assignments, you get to choose books that you like, that you may quote, as Ben says here, you may call great, right? But you need to justify their quote unquote greatness. What makes them great? Is it because other people think so? Is it because they have won awards? Is it because they are on the bestseller list? Is it because it's been made into movies? What makes it great? What's a great work of literature? You as a reader need to make up your own mind, especially within the context of being a student of literature. So just to say,
sorry, Doctor, can I just say something?
Please do.
So about the definition, I don't know, based on what you said, I kind of identified like the word across is very problematic. I don't know why I keep on focusing on this very textual thing. So across seems to be very touch and go, very horizontal thing. So I think maybe because scholars was trying to cover, they were trying to touch base with every culture, so to speak.
Yeah.
Hence, perhaps undermining the others within that certain country. Cross cultures. So I keep on thinking when we mentioned that, I was like, is there another phrase that I can replace across culture with when you talk about, getting our own definition?
All right, that's brilliant. Spot on. Is that Ruby?
Yes.
Okay. These are the things that will, when you look at a work and you find certain key terms problematic, that's the start of your research. That's how you begin identifying the hypothesis that you want to kind of prove, the thesis statement that you want to prove in your research. It is by engaging with the text and asking these critical questions. So maybe, Ruby, in your assignments, you can then go on to look for a definition of comparative literature that maybe replaces or substitutes the word across to something more attuned to your liking, right?
Oh, that is a good one, yeah.
So that like the first assignment, you can do that. I'll teach you how to do that. But that's why it is important for all of us to constantly look at something like this and engage with it. So coming back to, you know, the first thing that I told you at the beginning, you know, setting the scene. When you interpret anything, be it a work of literature or even an essay or a chapter in a book, your role as a reader needs to be constantly active. You don't allow the work to just wash over you. You don't just say, this is what Basnet says, this is the definition, and you kind of like regurgitate it. No, that's not what we do. At the graduate level, postgraduate level, that's not what we do, right? You have to pay attention closely to details and then engage with it. What's the writer really saying here? Why did the writer choose this word? What does this imply? Is it inclusive? Is it exclusive? So the politics, the hegemony needs to always be part of the discourse that we incorporate, especially for comparative literature, because it's over 100 years old and we have been using definitions from the West for the longest time. And now we're kind of like, you know, creating a counter discourse and challenging that definition, right? By bringing in scholars from our parts of the world, right? So I like that you're problematizing words like across, right? So yeah, the first assignment, you ought to be you ought to have fun by looking for something more relevant, and you're basically exercising your law qualification. So well done.
Sometimes I wonder if you look at, if you're bothered by one word, because in law we really, every word, even a comma, means a lot of things. I wonder if that is the right approach.
That is the approach of a literary scholar. You know, you're looking at gaps. We'll do that later in the semester. Pierre Mecheray talked about this, the silences or the gaps in the work of, or the unsaid in the work of literature. And earlier on, when I asked every one of you to reflect on that quotation of interpretation, all of you had that. You're talking about inferences, reading between the line. So you do understand that. But sometimes you don't need to read between the lines. Sometimes you just need to read what's there and ask yourself whether the word chosen includes me or not. And is the word chosen including me in a positive way or a negative way? So last week when we looked at Tutosi's definition, when he talks about the other and the marginal, it is inclusive of writings from outside of, you know, the center, the Anglo-American center. However, it includes it in a very disparaging manner, right? It makes us feel like we're marginal, we're just the other, right? So definitions needs to be more inclusive. However, these writers are Western-centric. So their writings and their definitions will incorporate their worldview. Yet at the same time, they use words like world literature. This is why I find it problematic. You talk about world literature, but you're not being inclusive. You're being very exclusive. So yeah, go ahead and problematize with that. So we move on. Before I stop to give you a short task. So the definition of comparative literature, back to Remarque's definition that we looked at last week, Henry Remarque's 1967 definition. Study of literature beyond confines of national borders. So now we have the word national borders, of relationships between literatures, of relationships between literature and other arts. So if you compare that, with Basnet's definition, 30 plus years on, the study of text across cultures. So the national boundaries and borders are not that important, that it is interdisciplinary across time and space. We'll come to this time and space when we look at the parameters, okay? So, just to quickly summarize the principles of comparative literature, comparative literature studies texts across national and geographical boundaries. Okay, national literature is basically the official literature of a nation. So this is basically your first e-task that's up on UKM Folio. So national literature is the official literature of the nation. However, in Malaysia, like I said last week, national literature is only literature written in Malay. Only written in Malay language. Doesn't matter whether it's written by a Malay or non-Malay. Malay for Salim and Alice. Malay is a race in Malaysia. Okay, there are various ethnicities and members of different ethnicities in our country, in Malaysia. Malaysia is multicultural. We have Malay, that's one. We have Indian, we have Chinese, but even Chinese, it's very heterogeneous. Even the Indians, it's very heterogeneous, right? So when we talk about Malay, it's the biggest community in this country, the biggest race in this country is the Malays. And the language written in Malay is considered the national literature. So if you're a Chinese and you write a literary work in Malay, your work is considered national literature. If you're an Indian and you write your work in Malay, your text can be considered national literature. Okay, so the language used, the medium is important in the way Malaysia defines national literature. But the official definition of national literature within the Western discourse is any text that's considered official in the nation, any literature that's considered official. All right. So in Malaysia, for instance, literary works written in other languages are known either as sectional or vernacular. That includes writings in Malay, in Chinese, writings in Tamil, in Mandarin, in Telugu, in Urdu, in English, and Iban, all these other languages that's happening in Malaysia. And because of that, if Ruby or Aimi or Shah or Fuzla or Liza, for instance, if they wanted to compare two texts, one in Malay and another one in Mandarin, written by Malaysians, that's not considered comparative literature. That's just considered comparative analysis. Okay, so back to this definition by Basnet, to study text across cultures. We've got many cultures in Malaysia. So you cannot take two texts from two different cultural contexts in Malaysia and call it comparative literature. You can't do that. All right. So Alice, can I hear from you? Is that the same in China? Do you have any other communities? Do you have any other languages besides Mandarin?
Yes, there's many different languages in China. Yeah, and
what other languages besides Mandarin?
We have 56 ethnic groups, and some ethnic groups have their own languages. Like Tibetan and Mongol.
But Tibet is a country in itself, right?
Tibet is a province of China.
Right.
In China.
Right. Okay. What about Salim? What about what about Iraq? Are there any other languages besides Arabic?
That's right. So in fact, in Iraq, we have like 4 to 5 languages in the same country, Iraq. We have Kurdish, which is the language of people in the north of Iraq.
The
And
Kurds.
we have Arabic, which is the language of all the people, most of the people speak Arabic, but at the same time, they have their specific language. For example, I can speak Arabic, but I'm Kurds, and I have two
Oh.
languages. Yeah, and also there is a language of Assyrian. I mean, people who speak Christian people who speak a special language, and also there is another language which is come from Turkey. We call it Turkoman. It's a language, spoken in some special areas in Iraq. Okay, but all of them are within the border of Iraq.
Right. Okay. So as you can see, again, back to the definition of comparative literature as studying texts across cultures. Within our experience, China, Iraq, and Malaysia, within our context today, these three countries, this definition cannot be used in its entirety, within this context, because the country, for instance, Iraq, China, and Malaysia, has many cultures, has many languages. So each text carry a different kind of representation of the culture in question. And if we take a text in Kurdish and another text in Arabic written by two Iraqi writers, for instance, that would not be considered comparative literature. So we need to problematize the operational definition of comparative literature before we can develop a methodology of how to do comparative literature. So that's why I'm focusing on this. So what, did I skip anything? Oh, sorry, did I skip something? Right, so just to kind of, conclude that part of the discussion, one thing we need to kind of keep in mind is we as students of literature, comparative literature in this context, we shouldn't privilege any text. There isn't a kind of a privileging attitude that some texts are considered world literature and others are not. That's the first thing that I want you to kind of keep in mind. And the second thing is, when you are choosing texts for your assignment 2 and assignment 3, make sure you choose them wisely, and that these texts must cross geographical boundaries, not just cultures, but actual political geographical boundaries. Okay, nation states, 2 texts from 2 different nation states, right? And just very quickly, going into the methodology of it, you must try to ensure that there is enough similarities between the 2 texts. Last week, I talked about fixed variable and more fluid variable, right? So there must be something that is converging between the 2 texts, something that is closer in similarities between the 2 texts, rather than they are completely different and there is very little similarities, all right? So what's important is for you then to establish the points of similarities or convergence and the points of differences or divergence. That's the methodology of comparative literature. Okay, so let's take a pause. Last week, we looked at Langston Hughes' I-2. Langston Hughes, an African-American poet in the 1930s, 40s America, right? I like what Salim said at the beginning when I asked you all how you approach literature and to kind of reflect on the quotation that I gave. One of the things that Salim says that, he starts off by looking at the environment, the writer, the influences, and then he goes into the text. So basically what Salim does is he looks at context before he comes to the text. So I want to give you a quick brief background of the 2 writers. Mahmoud Darwish is a Palestinian poet, right? So we all know the context of Palestine and what they have experienced with the Israelis, the Zionist government, especially, taking their land and occupying their land and making up a state of Israel, right? So in Mahmoud Darwish's poem, he basically declares himself, his sense of identity. So I want us to compare these two texts. So one is from the Palestinian context, Palestinian political, cultural context. Another one is the African American context. At the time, there wasn't an African American. It was very much the Negroes, the blacks, right? Langston Hughes was defining, quote unquote, the black brother, okay, in his poem I Too. So what I want us to do is, I've sent it to you. I'm not sure whether, I can't seem to stop sharing. Okay, I have sent you the poem here. Oh, I have to share again. I have sent you the poem. Can you all see what I'm sharing?
I just
Not
clicked.
yet.
Now? Can you see what I'm sharing?
Yes,
Yes,
and-
Doctor.
Yes.
All right. So Salim, you read Arabic.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So no, I'm saying you can read Arabic. Yes.
Sure, 100%.
Yeah. So you can read the Arabic version and compare it to I Too by Langston Hughes. For the rest of us,
Sorry,
we
Doctor.
can. Do you see this screen that I'm sharing
Yeah.
right now?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So you see Identity Card by Mahmoud Darwish. Can you all see this?
Sure.
Yes, Doctor.
Yes.
So if you read Arabic, you can look at the one on the right, the text on the right. If you want to use the English version, you can use the English version that's on the left. Okay? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to go through the poem. As you're going through the poem, ask yourself, what are similarities I see between this text and Langston Hughes' I Too? We looked at it last week, remember? Guys?
Yes, yes.
Yes, Doctor.
Now, this is the thing why I don't like about online classes. I can't see your faces, I can't see your expressions, can't see whether you are still with me. So yeah, this poem. Lisa, I'm going to share it on the WhatsApp. But the rest
Yeah,
have it.
I think you shared it on the
Already
WhatsApp as
opened it.
well.
Yes, okay.
Because Lisa just joined today, so yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you all 10 minutes, okay? Read this poem. It's a bit long, but it's pretty straightforward. Read the poem. I want you to ask yourself the questions that you had, the ideas that you had when you were sharing with me how you approach a text. Ruby talked about language and figurative language specifically, and the writer's intention. And Aimee talked about looking at the elements of the text and then making connection to the society. Salim talked about environment, looking at the writer, looking at influences, and then connecting it to the text. Alice talked about setting and the story, and before she can go into the text, she needs to know what the story is. Shah talked about the interconnection also, and so did Fuzla. But Fuzla's interconnection is between theory and themes with the text. Lisa talked about engaging the reader and how the text affects the reader's emotional state and psychological state and all this. So looking at your own approach to text, approach Identity Card by Mahmoud Darwish in the same way, in the way that you're used to, that you're comfortable with. Once you've gone through it, you've digested the text, then I want you to sit for a couple of minutes just to brainstorm. What's the similarity between Identity Card and I Too by Langston Hughes? Is there any similarity? Can these two texts be compared with each other? If they can, what can I compare them for? So Langston Hughes is a male poet, African-American, 1930s. Mahmoud Darwish is a Palestinian male writer, and this poem is in the 1960s. And to reiterate, Basnet, where is it? To reiterate Basnet, the two poems are literatures from across both time and space. Time, because one is in the 1930s, I think 1941. I'll check when I Too was published. One is in 1940s, another one is in the 1960s. So there is a crossing of time. Another one is a crossing of space. One is the Palestinian context. Another one is the African-American context in America. So the crossing of both time and space. So yeah, I'm gonna give you 10 minutes, all right? It's 3 o'clock. I'm gonna give you 10 minutes plus a 5 minutes break. We'll join again at 3:15, okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, doctor.
Thank you, doctor.
All right, doctor. Thank you,
So
doctor.
any questions
Thank you,
before we
doctor.
take a break?
No.
Okay, so I just want to hear your thoughts after that. After the break, 15 minutes break. I just want to hear your thoughts. Then after that, we will go back to the theory, looking at the difference between French school and American school. Then we'll wrap up the class. Okay, so I'll see you in 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, doctor.
All right. I hope you all had a good short break. Okay, so
Yes,
who would
thank
like
you,
to go
Doctor.
first? Who would like to go first?
Sorry, Doctor. Yes.
Salim?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, to tell the truth, let me first return back to the Mahmoud Darwish, the writer from Palestine. In fact, this is one of the poems from his, poem collections under the name of Awraq al-Zaytun. I mean the papers of olive. Okay, it has been issued in 1964. Okay, and as I understand, let me give you the comparative or the comparison between the two poems, the Mahmoud Darwish and I Too. In my point of view, both of them concentrate on what we call it lack of identity. Due to what? Due to due to violence. And this poem by Mahmoud Darwish has been written when first he has been traveled to another country, which is Lebanon, which is not next to Palestine. And when he returned back, they considered him as an inflators. A person who came from another country, and he doesn't have the right to own an identity. So he considered as a person from another country. And at the time, he was a Palestinian person. He was from Palestine. So this is, I do believe that can be put under the umbrella of victim of racial violence. Okay. So both of the poets, they suffer from this racial violence. Yes, and they want to say that they have the right to own an identity, and they have the right to eat in the same place, regardless to their skin, whether he's black or he is white. I mean they want to have legal rights. Yeah, this is my understanding to Mahmoud Darwish, because he came to one of the checkpoints, and they considered him as a stranger. He's not from this country. He's not from this place, the place where he was born. And they consider him as an inflator, as a stranger. And as a result of that, he wrote this poem in which he says, I'm an Arab. And he started to mention the number of his kids and his job, and he started to describe about his suffering, okay, to enter his own place, his country, where he is from, which is Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. Who would like to continue from there? Shah?
Okay.
Shah and then Lisa. Lisa put up her hand.
Okay,
Shah and then Lisa.
I can go first? Okay. So I see that he mentioned, Mahmoud Darwish mentioned a few times about write down. And also he mentioned not a few times, but 2 times about having 8 children and upcoming 9. So I know it's important that way. I think I consider it as important that he asked to write down, and of course there will be a meaning. And then from what I can interpret here is that he's not a beggar based on the lines. And then he's been working.
He's not a what?
He's not a beggar, as in, because he said he doesn't go from doors to doors, although we know that he's less privileged, and then he's working outside since little. And if I'm not mistaken, around that time, they are not, the Arabs, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they are not allowed to work in agriculture. That's why it's mentioned here that he works at a quarry, right? And then maybe the similarities is that they're not comfortable. And then the last part of the poem, it has this voice like they will rise or they will take charge or something like here Mahmud said, beware of my hunger and my anger. In I too, you can see that Hughes said that he will come, tomorrow that he'll be at the table, you know, like he will make himself a present. And then, so what I can say is that one is robbed somehow and another is othered. That's what I can see. Like the difference is like that. The similarities.
One is robbed.
One is robbed and one is othered. Like, yeah. I would love to listen to everyone's opinion as well. Thank you, Doctor.
Good. Lisa, do you want to say your thoughts?
Yes, please. Having read both of these poems, I found that there are like a lot of similarities in terms of both this poem expresses derocination, exclusion, but the way that that Darwish and Hughes express it is quite different. So Darwish, his poem, how to say, I felt his anger, maybe even a bit of hatred from his poems. Whereas Hughes, I feel sort of solemn and a bit sad after reading it. And to find out exactly, I sort of get why Hughes' poem is the way it is, because I'm guessing that this is before the civil movement where Black people were oppressed. But to actually find out what Darwin was actually so mad about, I kind of had to go on a research to find out who Darwin actually was. So yeah, the story behind his poem was that I think there was a fight at the checkpoint where he fought against the Palestinian officers, and actually Darwish family was forced to flee their home when he was just a child. He was from Birwa because of Israeli forces that attacked them, and then he took refuge in Lebanon for a year, and then later the territory was claimed by Israel. But now, despite that, he's now in his own homeland, is claimed as a refugee. So I get like why he is so mad, because he is from, how to say, he lived his life perfectly normal before the Israel came in. So there is a sense of, how to say, this is mine, this is my belonging, I have stayed here. Whereas Hughes, how to say, there wasn't really that sense of anger. I think it was because he was born during the time where Black people are oppressed. So he felt that it was quite normal to be treated the way he was. But despite that, he can't help but feeling sad about it, of his circumstances. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Who wants to go next?
I'll go next.
All right, go ahead.
The word or the theme that I thought is actually deprivation. And then I think the main highlight is the word I keep on staring at me in my face. So I think because both I'm gonna go a bit boring. Fixed variable is that there's a deprivation of I in both poems. And also, I'm maybe overstretching, but the deprivation of food, because both poems mention food. Maybe because there is that deprivation of basic necessities among African Americans and the Palestinians themselves. And then food may be a marker for culture. I think they may have some sort of a pride, in their foodie culture. But what is different? I suppose because I noticed that Mahmud Darwish, he was speaking to a specific person, whereas Langston was not. Okay, hence I think that is why the tone is different. Langston, it was as if he was telling you about the story of his life, whereas Mahmud was in a dialogue with you. Hence the tone. This affected both tones. So Mahmud Darwish, the tone is rather angered, and Langston, hopeful or sad, like Lisa mentioned. And also, the function of state or government is bigger in Darwish's poem. I think that's the political context of it. But I think for me, it's that the deprivation of it, I think is the main highlight to compare both poems. Yeah.
Thank you. Next. It's okay. You keep going around, coming back, coming out. It's okay. Go ahead.
Can I go
Fuzla?
next, Doctor?
Fuzla, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure.
Alice after Fuzla.
Okay, Doctor.
So, from both of the poems, I think the convergence point was it is themed around oppression. I think the previous people already mentioned it. Both of the poet or the both of the poet actually talks about facing oppression, and also talks about identity. So for I too is more of an identity as an American, and then Mahmoud Darwish is more of identity as an Arab. I think the point of divergence here is in Langston Hughes, the poem, the tone is more hopeful. I think it's more friendly because she uses words like darker brother, and then she talks about they'll say how beautiful I am. You know, it's something like he has hopes that someday he will be equal to his other brothers. So I think there is hope that there will be racial equality in the future. So for Mahmoud Darwish, I feel like he is emphasizing his identity as an Arab, as the person who owns the land. I mean, the land is actually theirs. He talks about it being stolen from his ancestors. Like he said, you have stolen the orchards of my ancestors. So there's that feeling like his identity is being stolen from him. Okay, and the poem sounds more of like a warning or a reminder that the Arabs are still there, they still have their identity, and they will fight against the oppression that they face. So that's what I get from the.
Good. Thank you. Sorry, Alice.
For the two poems are from two races. First is the African American, and the next is the Palestinian. So the two races have the same the same experience that they were colonized by others and lost their home and got discrimination by others. And from from the two poems, I see the strong desire. They want to get equal treat as others and get their own rights as citizens. And the first poem I too is more focused on the equal treat and want to be a citizen. And the second poem, identity card, have more have strong feelings like angry, and it seems the writer want to resist and because the racist got operations in the last stanza, the writer talk about the anger. So I think the feelings is more is stronger than the first one.
Okay, good. Thank you. Aimee?
I just want to add on about the theme of the identity. So both persona lost their identity to the outer forces, the oppressors. But So you're talking about not only they lost their identity, but in the poems, I think they are talking about reclaiming their identity. And what's interesting for the Darwish poem is that when I googled up, I found that actually the Israel, even though Palestinians have their own identity card, they need to actually have permission. Those who want to apply for the identity card, they need to have permission from the Israel in order for the Palestinians to get their own identity card. And there's two identity card. For Israel, they would be in orange, while the Palestinian, the identity card would be in green. So this already portrays the concept of othering, the concept of like differing the group of people from the original people that's supposed to reside there. So that's all I want to add about the poem.
Brilliant. So if you listen to collectively what all of you are presenting, you are spot on that you're looking at the discrimination, the hegemonic relationship between the dominant and the marginalized. You know, in each context, that relationship is played by different communities, and yet the minority or the marginalized or the subaltern or the victim, however you want to term them, or the other, they suffer the same outcome. And also the difference is that each one relates to their situation rather differently. You all are exactly spot on. The approach to their accepting or acceptance of their situation is different. One is using very imperative language, the statement like write it down, like, you know, it's almost like an order, right? So the imperative statement, the tone of the imperative statement is also very much an anger, of anger and the consequence of anger, frustration, you know. Whereas the other has, Langston Hughes's poem has a more hopeful acceptance of that hegemony. Rather than bitter and anger and frustration, there is a kind of tongue-in-cheek, there's a kind of a recognition that, you know, in future, not only will I be included, they will see how beautiful I am and they will be ashamed. You know, it's like, not only do I think I'm beautiful, they will be ashamed because they excluded me from the table at the beginning and now they have included me. Okay, so the element of the sense of agency and optimism and hopefulness is a lot stronger in I2. If you explore this a little bit more, Langston Hughes was part of the Harlem Renaissance. You know, he's not located within the Deep South where the blacks were, you know, experiencing the Jim Crow treatment. You know, he was part of the Harlem Renaissance. He was part of that movement in Harlem. So he was away from it, but at the same time, he captured the experiences of the blacks through his works of literature. So there's a tone, there's a difference in tone. Okay, so we move on. Second half of our class, looking at how are you all doing so far? Are you okay so far? Okay, cool.
Okay, I'm okay, doctor.
Okay, doctor.
All right, so we move on. It's coming up. Okay, so we stopped here. I thought you all did a brilliant job. So now we go into the two schools of thought, the French school and the American school. So basically, fundamentally, both schools agree on the principles of comparative literature. They agree that it should be studying of literature beyond the confines of a particular country. Okay, that is the same in both the French school and the American school. However, they differ in emphasis and approach. With the French school, the comparison of the two texts across geographical boundaries require knowledge of two literary traditions and two languages. So for instance, what we did just now, reading I2 in English and Identity Card by Mahmoud Darwish, reading it in English, i.e. the translated version, that would not fit the parameters of comparative literature within French school. Okay, so reading it in Arabic in its original form and understanding the nuances of the text within the literary tradition of the Palestinian literature in Arabic, that's more acceptable within French school's definition of comparative literature. So why is literary tradition important? You know, it's just a text, right? But as you yourself have explored, you know, just a quick search online, finding a little bit more about Langston Hughes. If you read up a little bit about Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance, and then read up a little bit about Mahmoud Darwish and the Nakba and being part of the movement in the Palestinian movement for resistance and for freedom and you know self-governance and all the rest of it. Part of that is incorporated in the literary tradition. So you cannot read the text and not know its tradition. What was the history of the literature produced by that community, by that nation, by that land, in that land, sorry. So for instance, if you read Malaysian literature in English, you know, you need to understand the history that came about in the development of Malaysian literature. And that history is not the same with the literary history of Arabic literature and the literary history of the Chinese literature. So French school demands that greater commitment to the text as well as the literary tradition and language of that text. So that's the key focus of French school. You know, while French school focuses on the text, however, American school favors an interdisciplinary approach, not just the text, but also to include essays and theories. So, you know, one thing Fuzla says, you know, she likes to look at the connections between theory and themes and the text. So that will be more the American school, okay? So looking at the American school specifically on this element of interdisciplinary approach, this is what Remarque has to say. Interdisciplinary methods give us, and I quote, a better, more comprehensive understanding of literature as a whole rather than departmental, fragment and several isolated departmental fragments of literature. It can do so best by extending the investigation of literature both geographically and generically, because literature deals with people in communities. Many factors come into play. So when we talk about interdiscipline, so you're looking at cultural studies, you're looking at sociology, you're looking at maybe even political studies, maybe even law, maybe even media studies. So because it involves people and communities, you cannot disregard these other disciplines where people and communities are being studied. Psychology, economy, right? So American School of Comparative Literature incorporates these elements of interdisciplinarity by allowing literature to be read alongside other disciplines in which the study of people and communities and cultures are being done. Why? In order to have better insights into literature as a whole. So to read literature and to disregard the history of the land and the history of the people and the cultures that grew out from that historical experience will not give us enough of an insight into the text. So that's why American school focuses more on this element, or rather gives emphasis on the element of interdisciplinarity. So when we talk about beyond the confines of a nation, so French school and American school accepts this. However, French school had strong reservations and in terms of its approach and methodology. They're very positivistic, which is data-driven. The next slide will explain on this. They are author-centered, which means the nationality. So in answer to someone's question last week, what about diasporic writers? So definitely within the French school, this is not incorporated. You know, if the writer is Asian American and the writer writes back about Malaysia, the nationality of the writer is more important than what the writer writes about. Even if the writer writes about Malaysia, if the writer is an American citizen, naturalized American citizen, the corpus cannot be seen as a Malaysian text. Okay? So the methodology needs to be specific. Otherwise, according to French school, otherwise comparative literature becomes quasi all-inclusive. It's like everything goes. So just to kind of explore a little bit about positivism as a research philosophy, this is something I said at the beginning when I set the scene and I asked you to interpret the quote of interpretation. So the role of the researcher in positivism, the role of the researcher tends to be very objective. The researcher does certain things, collect data, interpret data in an objective fashion. Okay. Beyond that, the role of the researcher is not of value. But if you think about theory, and there's one particular theory, reader-response theory. Reader-response theory focuses on you, the reader. How does this text that you read affect you, and vice versa? How does your worldview affect the reading of the text? You know, none of us here are African American. None of us are Palestinian. So our reading of the text will be based on our context. But imagine an African American reading I2 today in the 21st century, you know, in light of the kind of racial, you know, treatments, the discriminations the African American continue to face, you know, even after having an African American president and all that. That element of racism, discrimination, and the hegemony that is imposed by the white community or the white majority is still relevant in today's discourse. So an African American reading that poem will have a very different take. Likewise, a Palestinian reading Mahmoud Darwish's Identity Card will have a very different take from any of us. Okay. So with positivism, the role of the researcher is not to bring in his or her perspective into the discussion. So that is something that the American school allows for, which the French school does not. Okay, so something I want you to kind of keep in mind. So with regards to literature and other arts, French school disagrees. Why? What's their rationale? They fear the loss of the value of the discipline called comparative literature. You know, once you start to open up comparative literature and once you allow for other disciplines to come in, the demarcation of what is comparative literature becomes blurry. You know, if you had to describe what is comparative literature to somebody, where would you begin if you allow anything and everything to come in? Okay. So how would you compare two texts? What's the connection when you allow other disciplines to come in? So that's partly why the French school are very particular. So let's kind of like conclude that idea and the discussion a little bit. Yes, American school invites freedom. It sounds like it, doesn't it? But however, if it becomes too free and too loose, wouldn't comparative literature lose its focus or even emphasis as a discipline. All the same, yes, French school is too structured, but without structure, will anyone know what comparative literature is all about? So I'm just giving you food for thought, like just to kind of like, argue the case a little bit. I'm not for or against any approach. If Salim wants to take a very French school approach of reading the text in Arabic, if Alice wants to read a text in Mandarin and compare it with another text in another language, they're more than welcome to do so, right? But this is not to say that in my class, I'm expecting you to do the French school approach. I'm going to leave it to you on how you approach it. So the final thoughts for today's session is, I'm going to leave you with a couple more quotes to kind of like just to entice you a little bit about your role as the reader in this whole discussion. So what is there left to say for the reader if, for instance, a particular text has been read and reread, for many, many years? And here's an idea. This is what Professor David Damrosch, who is also a professor of comparative literature, had to say. Every Irish ballad has already been tracked down, every chapter, almost every sentence of Ulysses lovingly dissected, debated, reinterpreted. What can possibly be left to say? In these circumstances, cross-cultural comparisons prove to be marvelously illuminating and refreshing. So that's where comparative literature comes in. You may read a classic work by Shakespeare or Blake or any of your favorite authors, by Jane Austen or whatever, the literary text from the English canon. Anything you want to say about those texts, unless you bring in a comparative cross-cultural dimension, you're not going to add to the body of knowledge in that area, right? But the minute you bring in another text and you compare that text with these classics, quote unquote classics, then suddenly you have something new to add to that discussion. So that's partly why comparative literature is still relevant. And finally, another question to kind of leave you with: what does comparative study do to and for the readers? So, you may, this is one approach, one suggested approach. Reading the Trinidadian writer Sam Sutherland's book, it's set in 1956. Then reading Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which is set in 1958. Then reading Wilson's Anglo-Saxon Attitudes, which is set in 1956. They all have something in common, okay, but they all have something specifically unique. These three texts will force the reader to pay close attention to the use of language in its diversity, to the way it creates identity, both personal, national, ethnic, or even a community or a tribe and so forth, and embodies the sense or desire of belonging to a nation and or community, and of alienation from another. So all three texts focuses on these collective themes of sense of belonging. And what happens if you're not part of a community? You feel a sense of alienation. Yet each text is set in different locations, right? One is in the Caribbean, another one is in the continent of Africa, and another one is in the British Isles. And the language used is also different, right? One is standard English, another one's street English, and another one is Creole, which is a mixture of English with the Caribbean languages, maybe French, maybe any other languages in Trinidad. So the point of this is that you as the reader, you get to play around with this mixture of text. You can bring in text from various situations and locations, and you may be able to justify why these texts are comparable, okay, with a clear sense of operational definition of what is comparative literature and how comparative literature should be executed. So that's your role, okay? So if you think about it, I am not for the French school because I feel you as the reader, you have a say in the way the text affects you, okay? So I feel I'm clear enough in my definition of comparative literature, and I hope you have a sense, by the end of this course, you have a sense of your own approach of how you want to conduct the reading of text for this particular course. Okay, so I'll stop there. Any questions? Was that okay? Is that too much?
Yes.
Is that a bit
No,
heavy?
it's okay.
Yeah, it's need time to digest. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to digest. Ruby, I can't hear what you're saying though. I hope you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just noticed it was muted.
Are you murmuring to yourself or something to
There's a
the
lot
rest
of
of the-
murmuring for the past, like, for today. But I wonder, there is this thing about people being bilingual or is it monolingual? I wonder if that is why American school became the way that they are. Is it because the possibility of the scholars there being bilingual or trilingual or more is a little bit lesser than the French scholars? It's just my thought.
Could be, but to be fair, if you want to do a PhD in American universities for literature, for instance, you will be required to do, in most universities, a foreign language. You will have to. So especially in the comparative literature department, as much as American school appears to do things to work on translated works, they do expect some level of mastery of a foreign language. So like David Damrosch, for instance, if I'm not mistaken, he reads Mandarin very, very well. He's a scholar of comparative literature, but he also reads texts outside of English. So it's maybe that, but it is also because the people, I feel, in Europe, it's quite normal for them to know more than just English or more than just French or more than just German, right? Especially, for instance, if you live somewhere in Austria, you're bordering with different countries and you need to be able to, with Germany and with, parts of the rest of the world, the rest of Europe. So they know French, sometimes they know German. Of course, they have Austrian German and German, but but that level of acceptance of other languages seems more open for them, perhaps, right? But at the same time, you can ask yourself, in the Malaysian context, how open are we to being multilingual in Malaysia?
I mean, more than being a bilingual, I guess not so much.
Bilingual even, how open are we to being bilingual? Think about that, is bilingualism something that is accepted in all communities in Malaysia? I personally feel it is not. This issue, I personally feel that the issue that certain communities appear to feel that their language is sufficient and they're not open to learning other languages appears to be quite prevalent in Malaysia, right? More so in Malaysia than in other countries. So think about that. Like, how many of us here know Mandarin or Tamil or Telugu or any other languages besides English, right? And yet the Indians and Chinese, they know their language, but they also know Malay and they know English, right? So when we say we're bilingual with an international language, but how bilingual are we with other languages in our own country? That's what I mean. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So there is a kind of I wouldn't say the word inequality, but the level of acceptance of each other within the country. Let's ask Salim. Salim, in Iraq, how many people? What's the population of people who can speak Kurdish? Is it
I
only the
think
Kurds?
no, maybe 6 to 7 million people.
But is it only Kurdish people can speak Kurds? Do the Arabs learn to
good
speak
question.
Kurdish?
Yeah. So people who are living close to, I'm in the area which is close to each other. They speak two languages. For example, let me talk about myself. I have lived close to Arabs area, so I learned the two language. Now I speak fluent. I'm fluent in Arabic and in Kurdish as well. And we have the same case with many people. People from Kurds, for example, live in Christian or Assyrian areas. They speak more than one language. They speak their mother tongue, Arabic plus Assyrian. So this happened in my country, in fact.
Brilliant. I think it's also because of that if you notice, I don't know where all of you are residing, those in Malaysia, I don't know where all of you are residing, but if you reside in a predominantly monocultural community or society, you tend to just speak one common language, right? Like I'm from Penang. Penang is this island for Salim and Ren. I'm from Penang, which is an island up north, and it's a very multicultural populace. And I know growing up, I would see my uncle and my aunts being able to speak in Chinese with the neighbors, because our neighbors we had Chinese neighbors on both sides of our home, right? We lived in this double-story bungalow terrace, sorry. And my uncle would just come out and I'm like, oh, wow, so glamorous. My uncle would just greet the neighbor and talk to the neighbor in Chinese, but he never attended a school learning to speak Chinese and all the rest of it, right? So I think that's pretty common. But ask yourself, in terms of your localities, how exposed are you to people from other cultures and other communities? And because of that, how much of their cultures and language and values do you know, right? So I think that also affects how bilingual we are. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I will leave you all with that. It's almost 2 hours. So very quickly before we end, I'm just going to go around the class. We'll start with Lisa, your first class here. Do you have any comments? Do you have any thoughts that you picked up from today's discussion?
As I think, in your class before, one of the teacher courses, I was kind of knowing what to expect.
Okay, good.
I knew that during that semester I took it. Your class was my favorite class that semester.
Brilliant.
So I was glad that I joined this class. But it seems similar but a bit more comprehensive, and I feel there's a lot to take in. I may need to review some of the slides again just because my internet connection wasn't working so well. But recently, I think I a lot from the group discussion.
Yeah, I know. Seriously, I've been teaching this course for many years. This is a good group. We've got a great group right now. Round of applause to all of you. Seriously, this is a good group. I like the vibe that you all are giving me. So thank you, Lisa. Fuzla. I'm going around my screen, yeah.
Oh, okay. So,
today's class. Any
yeah.
questions, any comments, any thoughts?
I like the way the part where we did the discussion on the poems, the Mahmud Darwish and Langston Hughes. So I thought that was it's nice to see other people's point of view as well on the poem. So I
Mm.
thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That in itself shows you we can all be reading the same two poems, but every one of us will have a very unique take. And that reflects us as readers. That means it's not just the text that matters, it's what we see in the text, the meaning making that we bring into the text, you know. So yeah, thank you, Fuzla. Alice?
Doctor, I want to talk something about the Chinese national literature. The definition of Chinese national literature is different with that of Malaysia. In China, the national literature is focused more on the Chinese, the identity Chinese. Yeah, it's just if you are Chinese, so you write something that belongs to the Chinese national literature. Because we have 65 ethnic groups, so there are lots of languages. For example, the Hui ethnic group of Huizhu, yeah, in Chinese, they lives. Most of them lives in Xi'an, and they speak Mandarin and Arabic and Farsi. Yeah. So
Xi'an, the Muslim population, Xi'an, right?
yes, yes.
Yeah. How do you say
Yeah.
it again? It's not Xi'an. How do you say it again?
Xi'an in Chinese.
Very fluid. I go Xi'an. It's like, you know, two different words. Yeah,
Yeah.
we visited that place once, and it's beautiful. It's lovely. All right, thank you for that. Thank you for that input. Salim?
Thank you so much, Doctor. In fact, my happiness cannot be expressed by few words. Since I have worked in this topic a long time, but it was something randomly. I worked randomly, but I feel now I can work according to something organized, more organized, something structured. So I can't put into words how happy am I. Thank you for so much, Doctor. But what I need is, and what we need all, to go deeper into what we call it, the French school and the American school and the methods of making comparison, comparative literature. Thank you so much, Doctor. Very happy, Doctor.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you. Aimi?
I'm really glad that we actually did the comparisons between I2 and also Identity Card, because that's where I finally see how to compare these two literature, because before in the previous guys, I was kind of like distracted because I didn't get the same theme on what to compare with what.
Yeah.
So in here, I can clearly see like the theme, how to see like whether the theme is correlated or same with each text. And I also like the idea of we can choose what we want to believe. For example, you can either go with the French ways or you can go with the American way. So it's like you have this flexibility of freedom on what you want to work on. Yeah. And also coming back to the national, to the how accepting are we in terms of like the bilingual community in Malaysia. I think because I've been to a kindergarten back in my 5th and 6 years old punya days, and then I went to convent. I mingle around with Chinese students and Indian students. But when I went to high school, I went to an all Malay school. Not all Malay, but just a few Chinese students and very minority group of Indian students. I can see like the difference on the way they act and how they are very not aware, a little awareness of the culture of the other groups. So which saddens me. And then I went to UITM, also all Malay, which also saddens me regarding the awareness of other people's culture, how they
Same.
how they, I mean, like, I'm not trying to bash my own race here, but
No, but we need to keep an
Yes.
open
Say it,
mind.
I mean, say it.
yeah, because it's funny how we want people to respect our culture, our religion, but at the same time we do not respect theirs. So I always have like an issue within my own race because of that. So I'm glad that
I
we have
agree.
the bilingual discussion in this class.
I hear you. Thank you so much. Ruby?
Oh, I'm still grappling with my inclination regarding interpretation and the rigidity. I'm not sure why rigidity is part of how I see things, but yes, this text and context discussion, it really sticks with me even ever since last week. So I am wondering, I know that we must understand context, but I'm still a very text heavy person,
Right.
but I know that I must expand my viewpoint. So
Yeah.
hopefully that's what I hope to do, so.
Brilliant, brilliant. Just keep an open mind, whatever your concerns and your interests and your things that you want to explore in this course. Just keep an open mind that you will get to explore it in the coming weeks, as well as the assignments. Shah?
Hi everyone. Okay, first of all, it's nice to see different perspectives. I always like things like that because I think on my side it's always simple views. So I need to know from other others' point of view as well. And because we're doing, we compared two texts just now, right? I thought of one writer. It's Shanun Ahmad, Ranjau Sepanjang Jalan. It's in Malay, yeah, Salim and Alice.
The English translation is No Harvest But a Thorn, because I had to
Yeah.
study that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then with the adapted film, Rice People in I think it's in Cambodian drama film. Yeah, so I'm not sure if we can compare those two because one is situated in Malaysia and another one is situated in Cambodia. So I'm not so sure about that. So but it's interesting to like know different perspective of like geography, like you said just now. So I kind of need your help
Yeah,
with
sure.
that as well.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah.
Good. What I hear from all of you is, number one, you have your own mind. You know what it is that you are, that you think about, that you are trying to achieve. You have a clear sense of what it is that you want to get through, get out of this course. I like that very much. And number two, you are open to other people's opinions and thoughts. I think this is the fundamental of when we're doing comparative literature. You cannot say one text is better than another text. One text has these things to offer and another text has these other things to offer, but they are comparable because. I think that's the approach that we want to take. We don't want to say we have to choose a text that is quote unquote a great literary work, and then we compare with something else, something new, something emergent. That's not our approach, So Shah, in answer to your question, yes, Cambodian with Malaysian text, yes. You can even read the Malaysian text in Malay, the original, or you can read it in the translated version, and then you compare it with the Cambodian text. The bit that needs to be identified is how are they comparable? What is the point of convergence between these two texts? So listening to all of you today, I feel like you know what you're interested in. So my strong recommendation is to continue to explore. I'm just going to leave you with one homework. The article that I gave you in the WhatsApp group, the article on, where is it? This one, the article on Anglophone world literatures and introduction. It's an article. I want you to read this article, and the homework is this. I want you to read this article, and I want you to ask the term world literature. How does these authors, Newman and Ripple, how do they define the term world literature? Keeping in mind, this was published in 2017. Okay, so how how are these authors defining world literature in the 21st century? So next week, we're going from the 20th century of comparative literature, we're coming into the 21st century. And as we come into the 21st century, you are beginning to prepare for your first assignment, which is due in week 5, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm getting you started. The assignment in week 5 is basically asking you to identify articles such as these and doing a review on it. Doing a review on the article, okay? But the article must be on comparative literature. But this particular article is not on comparative literature, but it kind of focuses on it, looking at this concept called world literature. So this is just a start. Review this article. How do you review an article? One of the things that you do is when you're reading through the article, you can ask yourself, what stands out in this article for me? What are the key takeaways that I want to focus on? You don't have to go through the article and kind of look at every key point, but look at the entire article, read the entire article, and then ask yourself what this article says to you about the topic in question, which is Anglophone world literatures. Okay, so that's basically the task, and this task will also help you in your e-task, in the e-task that I've assigned you. Okay, any questions? So it's just a simple, what we've done today, no need PowerPoint slides or whatever, just a simple, a couple of minutes, give me your take on the article. All right? So that's also my way of gauging how well you do a review. This is also to prepare you for your first assignment. Okay, the review shouldn't be reading verbatim lines from the article. You should paraphrase. You should put it into your own words. You should be able to conceptualize. What's this article about? What are the key elements of this article? Don't just repeat things that's in the article. This is my way of checking whether or not you know how to do it. If you don't, then I'm going to have to guide you along. Okay? All right, if there's nothing else, we'll end class here. Salim, did you have a question?
Sorry, just I faced some problems, in the first lecture concerning the video that you sent it to us. So it doesn't work in Iraq. I don't know what's the matter.
The video doesn't work, or you can't get YouTube?
The whole lecture that you recorded in the first session, it didn't work. So
is it because you cannot get you can't get YouTube? Because I send it to I send my supervision recording that I upload on YouTube to my Iraqi.
So if it's on YouTube, I will check it today. So.
It is.
Yeah, hopefully it's gonna work.
Okay, inshallah. Let me know if you can't
Thank
get
you,
it. Yeah, let me know. Yeah.
Jazakallah.
Okay. So yeah, if there's no other question, I will see you next week, Thursday, inshallah. Anything, just message me. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Doctor.
Thank you, Doctor.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Robbie, Ruby, the
My
meaning.
brain is fried. I'm sorry, Salim. I'm still there. Oh my
Sorry.
God.
Sorry, Salim. You need to hear this. You can meaning our homework is to read the essay, right? I mean the article, right?
Yeah, it's just reading this article, and then we're supposed to figure out how the authors defined world literature, but we also are expected to review and conceptualize whatever.
But that one is I think for the preparation for the next, right? And then how is it different from the e-task? Sorry, I need to ask you.
Oh, so the e-task. So this is not the e-task.
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah. I think I don't know because just now with Dr. Zalina, right, when I went to Folio and I saw like e-task 1 and 2 and I'm like, oh, is it like both? But I think for this one, the article, we are just supposed to read it, and then when she and then we're supposed to give her
Our like
their
personal.
definition, and I
Yeah.
think it is expected that we give our take. Do we agree with the definition of
So-
world literature or not?
Correct. That's what
Yeah.
I understand. But for the ITAS haven't, right?
The ITAS, I don't think she has mentioned it yet. She kept on mentioning that there's going to be a first assignment, and this is
Assignment only.
just this is a teaser leading to it.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure what the first assignment's gonna look like, but I suppose I
Sorry,
think it's a review.
You need to understand because a Thursday is very packed for us. So that's why we're like here
Yeah.
and there. Okay,
Oh,
okay.
but then
Ruby.
another question. Do you remember for nation and narration? So we're supposed to present. I mean, yeah.
Just
Are
now.
we supposed to? So we're supposed to submit something also, right?
I
What are we
think
submitting? Is it the essay?
actually no. Actually, the way I understand, next week, we need to present. But I'm not sure in what way. Like just now, Aimee went with slides and everything.
I think it's that way. I was so shocked when she used the slide, and I'm like,
Yeah,
oh my god, is this-
I'm not prepared. Like everything
Yeah, and
else
I'm
is
like,
just
oh my
in here.
God. Yes, what crap did I present? Yeah, but so I guess but the ITAS mentioned no essay. The ITAS only mentioned presentation 14 slides maximum.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
if you go to folio, yeah. But I'm just gonna prepare some sort of a draft essay just to be sure.
Yeah, because at least you can put like some excerpts to the sides and
Yeah,
everything.
and then
So
suddenly
you-
Selena says, "I need an essay," then I'm like, submit.
yeah, that's
that
why.
kind of thing. Yeah, but
Okay.
I think it's only that there's no other assignments from other subjects.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, just meaning for us it's nation and narration, right?
Yeah.
Just this one and
Well,
what
do you have
the-
more from Occidental? Do you have Occidental assignments already?
Let me show you.
Oh my God, Dr. Melissa is. Oh my God.
This is like
Oh, what the heck? So that is Occidental, lah.
Occidental, so Malaya. So and then going with I don't know, but it's
Oh.
quite light now. Light. It is light.
Oh, you know,
Yeah.
you know, for popular culture, Dr. Anita, she's not well, so we don't have a lecture. But then she will give us a task, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm not going to try how I'm gonna do it.
I didn't know which to take because I didn't want it to clash with my cultural the class, right? We needed
Yeah.
to take
But I think,
literature appreciation or something. Yeah.
But both are rather heavy, I find. Both are very theoretical.
Even though it's an elective, even though it's an elective, it is heavy, I think, for me. Not as
Yeah.
heavy as this class though. Yeah.
Yes, I think Dr. Rai's lecture is the clearest in terms of
Yeah.
things.
Also, I think we need to read in every class, as in next week we need to know something at least for Dr. Shan's class, and then coming to my elective.
Oh my God. I read very slowly, you know. I didn't even finish McLeod's, and I'm like, oh my God, why do people read so fast? Oh my God.
Same. That's why
Yeah.
that's why you see me extracting lines and lines because that's just what I saw. And that's just one thing, but you
And
can't
I
do
only
that in
remember
this class.
captions. But I think that is it. I think and don't wait. Because I feel very confused when we did nation and narration. I find that the lecture is very compact. But then I realized we are doing 2 weeks worth of work within 1 week. Yeah, so that it's very fast. So I think our narration is the first assignment. And then I think I have a feeling ITAS 2 is coming next week.
Yeah, okay then. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Because it's recorded, so at least
Oh yes! Oh my God! It's recorded.
yes,
still.
it's recorded.
Like why is it like? So, okay. Bye bye Salim. Bye bye Shah.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a good time. Thank you so much,
Bye-bye.
sisters.
Assalamualaikum.
Bye-bye. Have a good time. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.